Welcome to Her Remarkable History. Remember, to support our channel, please subscribe. The scariest place in Tudor England, the Tower of London. The Tower of London has become one of the most feared and brutal castles and prisons used throughout history. It is a formidable fortress that saw great bloodshed over the years. Even up to the Second World War, it was used as a site of execution. It was where 3 queens of England would lose their heads, being beheaded in brutal fashion at the orders of Henry VIII and Bloody Mary I. Blood ran on the cobbled pavements of the tower, and it was a place where many more were prisoners being held in terrifying conditions before they were transported to their place of execution outside the walls of the tower. The tower was reserved as a place for royal executions and those in incredibly noble birth, but it was also a place where horrifying torture occurred. Because of this, it became the most feared place in Tudor England, and there was very few places across the country that provoked such a strong feeling of fear. But why is this? Why, if there was only a handful of executions during the Tudor period, did the tower become so feared? When it was first built, the Tower of London was planned to become an impenetrable fortress that stood on the banks of the River Thames, strongly enforcing the rule of the king. During the medieval period, it was a royal fortress and a place where kings and queens would spend time in lavish sanctuary. And it was only stormed once during the Peasants' Revolt. Before every coronation, the new monarch would spend time at the tower before they were crowned. But there was one particular part of the tower that encompasses the changing attitude and role of the Tower of London during the Tudor times. Traitor's Gate, as we know it today, was a feared entrance into the inner sanctum that initially started life off as a simple water gate. It was intended to be a gate where the king would come into the fortress by barge or boat upriver, in relative secrecy away from the eyes of the public, but during the Tudor period it became a feared entrance where traitors would be brought by river. These prisoners, who were mostly sentenced to death and executed, were taken through Traitor's Gate, hence its name, and were then imprisoned to await their death. Prisoners such as Thomas More came into the tower this way by Traitor's Gate, and this part of the fortress shows the change from royal palace to brutal prison that occurred during the Tudor period. But the most famous legacy of the castle during the Tudor period is most certainly the executions that took place there. As mentioned, the tower was a high-profile site where only those granted permission from the monarchy were allowed to be executed. It was either you were royalty or of such noble status that allowed one to be killed inside the walls, whereas commoners and other less privileged condemned individuals such as Thomas Cromwell, Sir Thomas More, Guildford Dudley and others were taken on the short journey to Tower Hill before they were beheaded on the public execution spot. There were many more executions that took place on Tower Hill than on Tower Green, the site where it's believed the scaffold once stood. Those executed during the Tudor period inside the walls were Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, Jane Boleyn, Margaret Pole, Lady Jane Grey and Robert Devereux. All of these were beheaded on the scaffold that it's believed stood at the front of the White Tower. Each of these 7 were buried then inside of the Chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula and interred under the floor where they still lay to this day. Many other bodies, such as Thomas Cromwell's, were brought back into the tower following their execution on Tower Hill and were interred inside the chapel. With this, the tower became a gravesite for around 1,500 people. But the nature and brutality of the executions inside the walls added great notoriety of the tower. It was the site where Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's second wife and queen, had her head struck clean off by a sword in one blow, and where Catherine Howard, the king's 5th wife, was beheaded by the commoner's axe. The execution of Margaret Pole was in particular a bloody one that saw an elderly woman being wrestled to the floor and being beheaded by a blundering axeman. It is these brutal scenes that helped the tower develop its fearsome legacy for great bloodshed. But one practice that was used more sparingly inside the walls was torture. Torture as a practice was used to obtain a confession or information from an individual linked to a crime. One of the most infamous uses of torture came after the Tudor times, following the Gunpowder Plot, with Guy Fawkes placed on the rack and so severely tortured that he could not even sign his own confession. But during the Tudor times, it was within the Tower that many different prisoners came, and a number were linked to religious plots and schemes, and co-conspirators needed to be found. One of the methods used was the manacles, in which a prisoner would be strung up and hanged up in the air by their arms. For a significantly long time, Jesuit priest John Gerard was subjected to this. And despite him being able to escape, he wrote of the immense pain that the manacles caused him. Thumb screws were used also that would cut holes into a prisoner's fingers, and the Tower even had its own exclusive torture methods. Little Ease was a tiny cell found inside the basement of the White Tower, and inside this oubliette-style dungeon, a prisoner would be forced to crouch for 24 hours a day. This was a terrible ordeal and would break someone, and was a horrendous form of psychological torture. But also developed at the Tower was the Scavenger's Daughter, developed by the Lieutenant of the Tower, Sir Leonard Skeffington. This was a framed metal rack where the head was attached at the top, the hands in the middle, and the feet at the bottom. This frame would swing in a way that would contort the body in a number of different ways, and it was perfect to complement the most infamous torture device of the time that was used inside of the Tower. The rack has gone down as one of the most brutal devices used to torture an individual. A prisoner was placed on a wooden board and then secured to it by a rope or chain. Then rollers at the end attached to the arms and legs would turn and someone would be stretched. Their arms would rip from their sockets, their hips would snap and legs would break. The Tower was even the site where a woman was racked during the Tudor time. Anne Askew, a young Protestant, was linked to a plot involving Catherine Parr, Henry VIII's sixth wife, and to extract information from her she was racked so severely that she could not walk after. She was carried to her execution on a chair, and the rack even claimed victims itself, with some dying on the torture device. As it was seen as an impenetrable fortress, the Tudor monarchs perceived the Tower of London as a perfect place to house prisoners. As mentioned, many of those who found themselves housed there were of royalty, and because of this they were treated respectfully and well. For example, Princess Elizabeth, the future Elizabeth I, who was imprisoned on the orders of her half-sister Mary I, was allowed to take regular strolls around different parts of the Tower. Walter Raleigh, when he was imprisoned, was even allowed to grow a special garden inside, and trusted prisoners could even go and speak with others in different towers. But the different towers inside made it the perfect place where prisoners could be kept in basements away from others. Some places in particular, such as the Salt Tower, were very tough, as the Salt Tower sat on the moat and the water of the River Thames would cause this particular dungeon to be very damp and very cold. This could make someone more susceptible to getting diseases and infections. It was a very harsh dungeon, and also the Cradle Tower was similar in this respect. One of the most compelling stories of the Tower of London, which can still be seen today, is the legacy of those prisoners who left their mark on their cells. Many walls inside of the cells are covered in graffiti of those prisoners who went before. You can imagine the pain and angst of those prisoners who carved their support for the monarchy or for their families by etching their family crest on the walls. Carved into the walls of the Beauchamp Tower are dozens of inscriptions, including the beautiful handwritten message from Philip Howard, the Earl of Arundel, who was held at the Tower for over 10 years before he died from illness. He wrote above the fireplace, "The more affliction we endure for Christ in this world, the more glory we shall get with Christ in the world to come." Also found inside the tower is an inscription made by Thomas Abel, the chaplain and priest to Catherine of Aragon, who took the Queen's side during the King's great matter, when Henry VIII tried to divorce his first wife. Abel later wrote to Thomas Cromwell in the Tower, "I have now been in close prison 3 years and a quarter come Easter. After being held at the Tower for 5.5 years, he was taken to Smithfield, where he was hanged, drawn and quartered in 1540. His carving is of a bell and his name. Thomas Smite, an Irishman accused of helping rebellion, was imprisoned at the Tower and was tortured by the scavenger's daughter. He wrote on the walls of the Beauchamp Tower, 'By torture strained, my truth was tried, yet my liberty denied.' Some carvings contain names, but others include dedications to faith and elaborate images. One of the most peculiar inscriptions is Hugh Draper's. He was an innkeeper accused of sorcery, and despite pleading not guilty, he created a mysterious chart inside of the Salt Tower that shows a zodiac wheel with the days of the week and hours of the days at night. But some of the graffiti can be linked to tragic figures who later were brutally executed for their crimes. The Tower of London lives on today as almost a millennia-old fortress that has a reputation for brutality, barbarism and execution. It is through the reigns of those kings and queens, such as Henry VIII and Bloody Mary I, that helped the Tower to gain its reputation. But despite being remembered as a site of execution, there were many more killed upon Tower Hill. It's a royal prison that the Tower is best remembered, and the stories of those prisoners who found themselves incarcerated within the walls can still be seen in the graffiti and carvings that they have left there. Today there are still many stories of suffering and horror that remain hidden inside the Tower's walls, and in particular that relate to its most brutal period, the Tudor times. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.